Hey, this is Mike Lindsay from Vital MX, and today we have a fairly unique comparison of a couple different off-road bikes that fall into a little bit of a niche category. That being 125 two-stroke off-road bikes. I was really curious how much difference can 125s be depending on the purpose they're made for in off-road. And again, this is not actually a shootout. It's not about which bike is better. It's more about looking at the use case of each style bike and trying to figure out how big of a difference those use cases are and really what they are the best at or what they would be recommended for. So in this situation, we took a 2024 Yamaha YZ125X. That's the cross-country race bike in this comparison. We have a Beta 125RR. It's a 2023 model. It's the race edition. This kind of blends the line with like an Enduro-ish race bike that they make. And then finally, we had a 2024 KTM 150XCW, the larger displacement out of the three here being a 150cc two-stroke. It's also throttle body injected, and this is basically a wide ratio trail bike. So again, 3 125s here. Most people might just go pick the brand they want, but really again, what are each of these bikes good at, and how different can a 125 be just by minorly tweaking it to try to set it up for something else? So in this case, starting with the YZ125X, this is the bike that I've had the most time on over the years. Yamaha regularly has intros for this bike. We've raced one at a works race before, a couple things of that nature. So again, I've rode this bike a decent amount, and of course it is very, very similar to its YZ125 motocross brethren. Basically, take the motocross bike and make it 5% mellower, 5% more forgiving, and throw an 18-inch rear wheel on it. Voila, you have the 125X. It is slightly tweaked for, again, the gearing, 18-inch rear wheel, slightly softer suspension, a little bit tweaked to the clutch, your basic power valve setting, pipe, a little of those things just to massage the power a tiny bit. But once you hop on it, it basically does feel still like a YZ125 off-road. Yes, again, it is a little bit more forgiving, but it is fairly pipey. If you ride it back and forth between the standard YZ125, it is noticeable the changes they make to make it a little bit more forgiving, but you still gotta be on your toes. It isn't really quite fun to ride because it's extremely playful off-road, but you gotta be on top of all your shift points still. It's a pipier style power character. When it's up and running, it's really rewarding, it's really fun. But again, you're hitting a hill climb, you're doing anything that's real slick, technical. If you miss a little bit with the power, you'll spin really easy, you'll bog really easy, you gotta be on top of everything. So one thing I found with it is, as with any 125, it teaches you a couple excellent skills off-road, namely carrying your momentum. Because again, between it being a little bit still on the stiff side, meaning that it's just a slightly tuned down motocross setting, the bike is a bit deflective, it does react to the surface. When you get up on the pipey power, it tends to deflect and just kind of bounce all over the place. It's hard to keep it tracking. So momentum is your friend on this bike, which plays into everything again. Getting over logs, getting through rain ruts, going up and down rock sections. The more momentum you can carry, the less you're requiring on the power picking up, the better this bike is. So again, just like riding motocross, the 125 teaches you to carry momentum, particularly this YZ125X does that. So when you're proper on the bike, you're proper on your clutch, your line selection, all these things, the bike is super rewarding and fun. Again, this bike just screams, I wanna go race a Works, a Big Six, maybe a Hare and Hounds, if you had a bigger tank, a GNCC, because it's so close to the motorbike and it's so aggressive and fun. Again, it's a little bit softer for off-road, but something it does still feel quite like a motocross bike is the balance of the bike. It is decently stiff on both ends, so it doesn't squat as much. It doesn't feel like it's as pitchy. It feels a little bit more held up and balanced in the stroke, which in some places, again, makes it very playful, very easy to hop off, bounce off things. However, though, again, it isn't as forgiving. It doesn't make for a terribly fun trail bike. Like I said, if you really want a challenge, if you're a really hardcore 125 guy, you would still probably enjoy it. But when the going gets tough, riding this bike gets tough. It just is not very forgiving. It is not user-friendly in some situations. You're trying to, being that it doesn't have a wide ratio gearbox or anything, it does not have a good first creeper gear. It lights the tire really easy when you're just trying to dog paddle up a little bit of a shell rock section. Again, if you make a mistake going uphill, you have to very quickly react with the clutch or shift to kind of keep everything moving and in line. So those are some of the drawbacks. The YZ125X seems to be, for me, the easiest bike to point on this test of who it really should belong to. your young kid upcoming that's racing off-road, that's transitioning off A5s, this will continue to teach them great skills. It's very easy to race compared to a 250F off-road, so it's still a good transition bike. Somebody, again, is just planning on racing 125s aggressively in off-road racing classes, particularly more West Coast space stuff, would find this bike enjoyable. It has some of the least off-road based amenities being a cross-country bike, lacking big tank, different actual transmission ratios, things like that. So again, it's just like a motocross bike that is just dipping its toe into the off-road waters. So again, you kind of know what to expect with that motorcycle. Going to the absolute opposite end of the scale is the KTM 150XCW. Again, this is basically a trail bike. We've got a headlight here, we've got a wide ratio 6-speed, it's throttle body injected. This is very soft suspension, is a very, very plush motorcycle. Whether it's been the TPI or the throttle body injected 2-strokes that the Austrian group's been making, they have kind of had a lukewarm reception. And I've heard this particularly with the smaller displacement bikes because there isn't a lot of that 2-stroke character to them. It isn't very pipey. It's surprisingly, I know it's a 150, no replacement for displacement. It is up 25 cc's over standard 125, but it feels like so much more when you add that in to the injection and to the wide ratio, how luggy and creepy it is. It really feels like a mini 250 or 300 in that regard. You can basically make a mistake on a hill, pop it back down in the first gear. You can be in a rain rut with rocks in the bottom, and you can just creep up and out and over the section where any of the air bikes we were testing, really easy to light the tire. The rear end just starts to bounce all over the place. KTM just squats down, tracks, and amazingly enough, it is sometimes very hard to feel the rocks, the square edges under you. The rear is just so compliant and it's able to track up through those sections. It's easily the most forgivable. You can ride it a gear higher, it'll lug itself out. It's not necessarily that quick feeling. Again, it doesn't run extremely well up top. It feels very flat up top, very typical of a trail style 2-stroke. It doesn't have that motocross just scream it feel out of it. So when you're really trying to push the bike, it does feel a little bit lethargic up there. However, it is extremely consistent to ride because of how forgiving the engine is in other scenarios. So on one hand, I would label that it doesn't have the fun factor that the other 2 bikes in the test had in this comparison, but it does have fun factor from the fact that if you are struggle busing on the 120 on a small bore 2-stroke off-road bike, it is the most forgiving of the group. It did make things, technically speaking, easier than anything else we tested. And that in itself is good fun factor. The suspension on this bike, very, very plush, very soft, very divey when you grab a handful of brake, but it's amazing when you get to a trail or a true enduro setting, little rock gardens, just stuff that normally you were looking at and you're like, oh, front end's gonna deflect. I'm gonna shoot into the bush now. I am about to fly off the side of this trail. Just eats it up, just goes right over and it just feels like a small acceleration bump. It's able to just roll over that stuff and continue to keep moving. So again, it's the most forgiving bike in this test. It's not necessarily the most exciting. It doesn't necessarily invoke the most fun factor. And that's where I was really struggling who this type of bike is for. I would say the obvious one is more of a beginner, entry-level skill rider off-road, maybe somebody that's a bit smaller on the petite side that doesn't want to handle the weight of something bigger. Then again, the TBI bike isn't exactly light. All these small bore 2-strokes are light in comparison to a lot of any of the other model ranges, other bike options you'd have, particularly 4-strokes, but it is still heavier compared to some of its competition. So again, maybe somebody that's a little bit smaller that isn't ready for 250 2-stroke or 300 2-stroke off-road would enjoy this. It definitely falls into that trail putting around category. The gear ratio, the wide ratio is good enough to get up in open desert conditions, be able to move along, but you're still really constantly on the throttle with this bike, keeping it moving on those big open conditions. It's not something I would particularly want to go race, albeit I gotta hand it to KTM. The new closed cartridge fork and the PDS shock on this were actually quite excellent. Again, they're soft, they're easy to blow through, but they have better bottoming control than I remember these bikes having in the past, and you can have some fun pushing them in some sections where you really naturally think, this is trail suspension. I'm just gonna G out here and feel it just clank. And it does just enough to keep away from that. Again though, that user case is tough. I wouldn't really recommend this for, again, a young kid that's gonna go race your GNCCs, your works. Maybe if they're strictly in more of an enduro situation, this makes a little more sense, but it really is a trail bike. This is a go have fun on the weekend. This is, I want to experience a small bore two-stroke, but I want something more forgiving than the pipey feel. Lower elevation helps. Higher elevation, I have a hard time figuring out where the user case would be for this, just because the total output isn't enough once you get up far into mountain ranges or you're just in a higher base elevation. Usually all these bikes were tested down anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 feet the couple different times I rode them. And it works fine down there, but I can't imagine doing bigger hill climbs or anything at a higher altitude where it wouldn't be a little bit frustrating on this bike. So again, this one's the hardest one. Like, beginner kind of wants to trail ride, isn't ready for the bigger bike, but again, the bigger ones, even your 250 and 300 that fall in this trail category, are pretty mellow and easy to ride. So this bike really, to me, falls in a niche category. You really got to know what you're looking for and what you want out of this. And the problem is, I think it is a little bit narrow on how far you can take the bike. The last one in the test was a 2023, again, Beta 125RR Race Edition. So they have their standard RR, the Race Edition has a couple little extra upgrades, and this falls into more of like an enduro race category bike. Definitely not as pipey and cross-country feel as the YZ, but not as mellow as the KTM. It definitely blends and blurs the lines. It does have a little bit more excitement in the engine. It is a carb bike. It has good 125 two-stroke character. It has a power band. It picks up. It's playful. But at the same time, it is a tick luggier than like a true cross-country bike that I've ridden. It is a little bit easier to, a little bit more forgiving in certain sections. It doesn't creep super well, doesn't have a wide ratio for that kind of thing, but it is a little bit more forgiving on where the power comes on and how quick it is to recover. So it helps blend those lines a little bit. But if you're racing it, again, if you were gonna do something more in the GNCC works, that style era, it still has really good mid to top. It picks up, it feels racy. So it blurs those lines a little bit and has a good balanced engine package. And from what we've heard, the 2024 model of this has an all new engine that is supposedly a pretty good performance jump over this. Again though, this test isn't really about these specific bikes being better than each other, just more about how the user cases work and comparing that. Definitely the Beta 125R, being more of like an Enduro to an Enduro race bike, has, again, a little bit of a softer suspension character than a cross-country bike, but more hold up than a full trail bike. It's still very plush. It's very noticeable on tree roots, rocks, things that normally would make the front end or the rear end deflect. And actually, the rear end is probably the most notable. I said with the Yamaha, with it being a cross-country bike, when you have pipier power mixed with decently stiff off-road suspension, when it's up on that pipe, the rear end just tends to deflect. It spins very easy. It deflects off things. You have to have a lot of momentum to keep it moving across. The Beta, on the other hand, I actually could use the pipiness of the power a little bit because the rear end was more forgiving. It didn't feel quite as deflective. It definitely squatted, tracked better. Just didn't catch you off guard as often. So it made it, again, a little bit more forgiving and not having to be quite as much on my toes as the cross-country bike was. It's still, again, though, it is a little bit softer. If you start getting in your head a little too much, you're pushing this bike, you can definitely G it out, bottom it out. It won't have quite as much hold up and you can't maybe launch it off and send it into G outs, into ravines, things of that nature quite as easily. The Beta is probably the most interesting for me because I think it has the widest use case. I can see this being a very fun, again, if you're just really into small bore two strokes and want something to go trail ride, do more enduro style riding, do desert riding. This thing kind of has a good enough power character that's easy enough to use to go play ride on, but at the same time, I could easily take this bike and race actual off-road on it. Again, the power is good enough, the suspension components are good enough on the Race Edition with KYB's front and rear. So to me, the Beta is the widest use case out of all the bikes. The second is the Yamaha, where it's more into the race off-road. I could even almost argue a vet rider or a weekend warrior that likes a 125 but wants something slightly more forgiving would probably love this on a vet track. The softer suspension of that cross-country bike would be a little bit more forgiving on a weekend track that's really stuttery, choppy. But again, the KTM being the trail bike, that's the most confusing one. I feel like the use case of it is the smallest, even though that bike has some very standout character and features on it that make it noticeably better than the other two in its own little realm. If you want a little bit more detailed feedback actually on how these bikes worked, how the power is, the features through them, electronics, lecture start versus not. If you want more like detailed reviews on each one, you can click the link below. I actually did a write-up on all three bikes for an article that just gives you more of a review basis on each motorcycle. Again, this video is just to break down and kind of compare how the three act when around each other and in similar situations where I found the user case for each one. If you have any other more questions you want to have answered just more from this video, throw them in the comments section below and I'll do my best to get to them. As always, if you like our content, give us a thumbs up, like, and subscribe, and thanks for watching.